This video is the continuation of my previous one, which's title is "The Russian Spring Offensive is already in full swing and this is its most dangerous direction." In that video, I have described a Russian tactical breakthrough right between the operational axes of Pokrovsk and Taratsk. The Russians managed to break into the Ukrainian defenses held by the inexperienced 157th Mechanized Infantry Brigade and the understaffed 111th Territorial Defense Brigade. The Russians stick to their battle-proven procedures, the balance-shifting attack method that I have described in this channel many times, and they mixed it with a strict, predictable, but seemingly well-functioning timetable of attacking in every 2 or 3 days. What was new that instead of assaulting with dismounted infantry assault groups, they employed a new method of transporting infantry to the assault departure line. Instead of armored vehicles, they put the troops on motorcycles. This method seems to be suicidal for the first blank, because if the defenders' artillery and small arms have not been adequately suppressed, riding a bike on the battlefield is not the key to the long and peaceful life. However, if the defender's artillery and small arms have been suppressed, the defender can only use its drones. And against drones, 96 fast-riding motorcyclists can easily saturate the defender's targeting and fire management system. Therefore, the bulk of the assault infantry forces can reach their objective, contrary to the event if they try to advance on armored vehicles. On the 29th of April, this method led the Russians to the southern edge of a village called Novoa. At that exact time, I finished my previous video claiming that the Russians may exploit their breakthrough somewhere around the 6th of May, deducting from their well-known methods and schedule. But to do so, they needed to widen the narrow corridor of the breakthrough, and they acted accordingly. On the 5th of May, the Russians tried to widen their corridor towards west by executing a recon by force task towards Novoa. A Russian mechanized infantry squad reached the perimeter of the settlement, but by the end of the day they have been beaten back by drones and the small counterattack of a Ukrainian infantry squad. But what is more important, that the Russians elevated their operational tempo. From this day, they deviated from the usual 2 to 3 days attack schedule. Instead of attacking on the 8th of May, they launched an attack on the 6th. So I was right, but differently than I thought. The offensive in itself has some very interesting elements. The offensive operations in this sector are executed by two Russian formations, the 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division and the 68th Army Corps. Deducting from the location of their units, I drew the sector boundary between them. The 20th Division is still responsible for the attack towards Kostiantinivka, while the 68th Army Corps is responsible for attacking towards Pokrovsk. The 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division exploited the fact that with the Recon by Force mission, the Russians managed to create an image to the Ukrainians that they intend to widen their corridor before another push towards north. However, I have to stop here for a minute to explain what does full-scale attack means in this situation. The 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division has 3 motorized rifle battalions on paper. Footnote: the Russians call them motorized rifle, but they are mechanized infantry according to the NATO definition. What is more important, that these 3 battalions bore the brunt of the fighting in the previous 2 months. It means that they had a combat power altogether no more than 1.5 battalion. The other important element is the terrain, as always. The axis of attack of the 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment was 5 kilometers wide. Normally, this is the width of a regiment's attack corridor if this regiment has been deployed in the main direction of attack. But in the era of transparent battlefields saturated by drones, this 5 km is convenient only for the attack of 1 battalion, because troops must be dispersed more than before. Knowing the structure of the Russian assault infantry units, it means that the Russians had approximately 5 assault companies available for the attack. Considering these facts, it is now clear that why I state the following. The 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment's decisive attack towards Novoa, aiming to complete the breakthrough, was executed by 3 assault companies in the first echelon, and they probably had 2 or 3 companies in the second echelon or in reserve. After learning these little details, we can have a clearer picture of this attack. The main attack axis was at the left flank, where the Russians deployed an assault company in order to completely capture Novoa. The base of this attack was their toehold captured 2 days before. As a shaping operation of this main attack, they sent one, but deducting from the terrain, I rather say 2 infantry assault companies in order to clear and capture all Ukrainian positions on the farmlands and tree lines east of the village. This attack of the 33rd Regiment was very successful, and by the end of the day they captured the village of Novoa and an area 5 kilometers wide and 2 to 3 kilometers deep. In military terms, it means that the 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment decisively broke through the defenses of the Ukrainian 157th Mechanized Infantry Brigade. This operation was a huge success. According to geolocated Russian footage, the Ukrainian defenses in and around the village were far from ready. They hastily sent infantry reinforcements on armored vehicles to trenches that were not complete. This had tragic results both in terms of dead, wounded and captured. However, on the 7th of May, the Russians didn't exploit their success. On the 7th of May, instead of attacking towards north, the Russians, strictly according to their schedule, 2 days after the previous recon by force mission, and perfectly at the perimeter of its area of influence, launched a whole assault company towards Malinivka. This attack has suffered casualties from Ukrainian drones early at its first phase, the advancing to the assault departure line. But the bulk of the attacking forces had reached the first Ukrainian trenches and managed to dislodge the defenders from there. However, the Ukrainian 117th Mechanized Infantry Brigades and the 1st Tank Brigade's drone units cooperated professionally, and they continuously maintained the observation and the fire on the Russians. They attacked them with FPV drones, artillery and drone-drop grenades. Thanks to the consistent and multi-layered system of fires, by the afternoon the Russian attack has been beaten back. These Russian attacks seemingly didn't achieve much, but in reality, based on military logic, they were successful. They gathered accurate information on the strength and attitude of the Ukrainian defenders at the operational left flank of their breakthrough. Furthermore, it was the Russians' fourth attack in this direction in 8 days. If we blend this fact with that the Russians had to widen their corridor, it created a picture for the Ukrainians that the Russians will put their main effort here in the first half of May. The Russians elevated the operational tempo of the 68th Army Corps and pushed on the offensive. On the 8th of May, they sent another assault company towards Novoa. This attack had been carried out by the 57th Motorized Rifle Regiment, which is a new information to me, so I adjusted the map accordingly. But what is more important, that this attack was adequately supported by drones and counter-drone measures. And what is even more important is the Russian deviation from their timeline. By attacking not 72 but 24 hours after their previous attack meant that the Russians managed to surprise the Ukrainians. This deviation from the centrally prescribed timetable resulted in a Russian tactical success. To add salt to injury, the Russians also managed to advance towards Malinivka and captured the highway junction once again. The Russians maintained the elevated operational tempo, and they launched their next major attack on the next day. The 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade exploited their toehold in Malinivka, captured on the previous day, and launched a two-pronged attack in 2 echelons. As a shaping operation, they sent a whole assault company towards the west, and while the heavy close-quarters combat was raging on, they sent another company towards north, widening the tactical breakthrough of the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade and enveloping the Ukrainian subunits behind Novoa from the left. By the end of the 9th of May, the operational situation around the Russian Bulge was critical. Facing west near Malinivka, the defenses of the 1st Tank Brigade had been breached, and the newly arrived Corps ex-Police Brigade could not stop the Russians only after they had achieved a tactical breakthrough. In the north, the Ukrainians could not stabilize their defenses. Therefore, they tried to rush hastily assembled reserves to ill-prepared defenses with tragic results as described earlier. To their luck, the Russians' 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment was far stretched from its original starting position, and I assume they also suffered casualties in the process. At least some social media posts of the Russian mule blogger Dva Mayora states that in these days infantry and raw units of the 255th Regiment have been deployed to strengthen the 33rd in the first echelon. Also to the Ukrainians' luck, the terrain favored the defenders here. Water obstacles hampered the Russian maneuver and made pretty obvious in which direction the Russians will proceed. This could help the Ukrainians to concentrate their efforts into the necessary directions. The situation was hanging on a thread for the Ukrainians. With one successful attack, the Russians could step into the exploitation phase. It seems that the Ukrainians managed to temporarily hold the Russians thanks to all of this, because in the next 5 days the Russians couldn't advance in their bulge, but they advanced elsewhere. At the southwestern shoulder of the bulge, the Ukrainians had strong positions along the built-up area and the water obstacles. However, the Russians exploited the disturbance caused by their success near Malinivka and attacked in a surprising direction. They executed a daring wet gap crossing through the Kazany Tarets River and its small water reservoir. It seems that this attack caught the Ukrainians totally by surprise, because by the end of the 12th of May, the Russians captured the village of Miralyubivka. The Russians spent the next day with strengthening their freshly occupied positions and fending off Ukrainian drone attacks. But what is more important, that it seems the Russians needed 5 days after their success near Novoa to reorganize and regroup. On the 14th of May, however, they launched small attacks along a wide front and managed to advance to the next tree line at the tip of the bulge. The next day, the 15th, brought no ease of the Russian pressure. Quite the contrary. The Ukrainians had to give in to the Russians and emptied their edge positions near Nova Poltavka and Stara Mykolaiivka. On the 16th, the same events happened. The Ukrainians retreated from Yelizavetyivka and they further retreated towards Zarya. Please allow me to stop for a minute again. According to pre-2022 field manuals, both Western and Russian, the third phase of a decisive operational attack is called exploitation. In the exploitation phase, the attacker has already broken through the defender's brigades and fended off its counterattacks. In the exploitation phase, the attacker does not execute force-oriented attacks aiming to destroy enemy units, quite the contrary. In the exploitation phase, the attacker executes terrain-oriented attacks aiming to capture key terrain features such as bridges, causeways, important hills, in order to force the defender's units to retreat even if they hadn't been defeated yet. Thus, word by word, exploiting the previously achieved success. In the 3 days between the 13th and the 15th of May, we could see the Ukrainians withdrawing their units which hadn't been defeated, but they found themselves in perilous situation. It clearly looks like an exploitation. But where was the breakthrough before? Albeit the Russians achieved tactical breakthroughs, but they had to constantly fight their way forward, assaulting another Ukrainian position each day. It does not look like a conventional breakthrough. Well, in my point of view, in the era of transparent battlefields saturated by drones, this is the breakthrough that can be achieved. Until drones cannot be countered effectively with air defense artillery or laser guns, the tempo of the infantry assault groups define the tempo of an offensive. And this makes the breakthrough rather look like a giant amoeba slowly growing around its objective. It is like watching military operations in slow motion. But anyway, this is when military theory is adjusted to the reality. Ladies and gentlemen, we could just see military science in the making. And now, back to the events. On the 17th of May, the Russians didn't release the pressure on the Ukrainians. The 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 57th Motorized Rifle Regiment nicely coordinated their efforts thanks to the existing divisional and corps-level command structure and advanced along a wide front towards northwest. On the 18th, the 33rd Regiment shifted its balance to its right flank and advanced along a water reservoir north of Novoa. On the 19th, the 57th Regiment advanced a bit towards Popiv Yar, and on the 21st, the 255th Regiment reached the outskirts of Zarya. On the 22nd of May, the Russians further advanced with their exploitation both in the north and in the eastern flank. This week brought a huge Russian operational level victory. In the exploitation phase, the defenders' main goal is to retreat to a defendable line and try to solidify the defenses there with the newly arrived units. Cas Supri, this is what had happened. The Ukrainians sent a serious number of reinforcements to the region, and in the same time they tried to use the terrain, mainly water obstacles and built-up areas, to their favor. All in all, by the 23rd of May, the Ukrainians managed to stop the Russian exploitation. But it doesn't mean that the Russians would ease the pressure, quite the contrary. The Russians intended to advance further, but in order to do so, now they had to start the whole process all over again. They had to penetrate the Ukrainian defenses, grind themselves forward through the gauntlet of the defenders' fire, break through the first and second line of defenses, fend off counterattacks, and after that exploit the success. In these conditions, introducing the pursuit was out of question. The Russians' main goal was to advance further towards north and west. But in order to do so, they had to mop up this area at their bottom right flank. The easiest way to accomplish this is to attack towards Yablunivka. In order to do so, the Russians introduced intensive preparatory fires both by drones and artillery. But of course they did so not just towards Yablunivka, but towards Rusny Yar and Popiv Yar. May I add one more thing before we could go further? As you can see, I drew the deducted sector boundaries between the three Russian formations responsible for the offensive. From the right, the 150th Guards Motorized Rifle Division was facing Taretsk. The 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division was attacking in the center towards north, and the 68th Army Corps was attacking on the left towards west. Their actions were coordinated by the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army. The presence of these higher echelon formations provided a significant advantage to the Russians in terms of coordination. This is a problem hurting the Ukrainians for at least a year. I cannot underline enough that the need of organizing a functioning operational level command system is a must if the Ukrainians want to save their country. On the 25th of May, the Russians continued their offensive by commencing the penetration. After the previous day's fire preparation, they launched an infantry assault group towards Yablunivka and managed to enter to the most western edge of the long village. Parallel with that, in brutal close-quarters combat, they managed to advance inside the ruins of Malinivka. It seems that not just me, but the Russians themselves saw this situation as the beginning of the next operational phase because they returned to their tried-and-tested methods, the balance-shifting attack method combined with the strict schedule. In this way, they hope to reduce casualties while constantly maintaining the pressure on the Ukrainian defenses. Perfectly aligned with that, the next Russian attack came on the 30th when an infantry assault group of the 57th Motorized Rifle Regiment advanced a bit towards northwest and penetrated the edge positions of Popiv Yar village. The next attack came on the 5th when the Russians advanced a bit north of Zarya. According to their methods, the next Russian attack came on the 7th of June when assault elements of the 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment advanced a bit further east inside Yablunivka. On the data cut-off day of this video, which is the 10th of June, it is clearly seen that the Ukrainians managed to contain the Russian exploitation by around the 24th of May. However, it is also clear to be seen that the Russians can maintain the pressure and attack constantly until they reach another breakthrough. And now, please allow me to draw some conclusions. First and foremost, I would like to draw your attention to the topic of coordination. This Russian victory has been achieved by the subordinate units of the 68th Army Corps and the 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division. But observing their coordinated actions, I am sure that the whole operation was planned, led, and coordinated at one echelon higher by the command and staff of the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army. In the same time, the Ukrainian units arrived with low level of coordination and their operations seems to be not so well coordinated. I cannot highlight enough that the Russian advantage in terms of coordination worth more than any kind of advantage in terms of numbers or equipment. Coordination is key. In May, the Russians fought outstandingly successfully. All of their operations achieved their goal except the one against Malinivka on the 7th of May. All of this means that in the 3 weeks from the 3rd to the 24th of May, the Russians achieved a significant operational victory. They broke through the Ukrainian lines by definition, and they successfully executed some actions in the phase of exploitation. This is something that we can rarely observe in this war. However, as I said earlier, it was very interesting to see these operations. They looked like if I would observe the slow motion video. It is because in the era of drones and transparent battlefields saturated by sensors, the speed of the operations will be tied to the speed of the dismounted foot soldier. It will remain true until we cannot find a way to effectively counter FPV drones and other loitering munitions. According to my analysis, the exploitation phase of the Russian offensive from the south towards Kostiantinivka terminated on the 23rd of May, so the 24th of May is the boundary between two operational phases. From that day we can observe a new phase in which the Russians have to penetrate the Ukrainian defenses once again. Well, that is all that I wanted to say. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. Thank you and see you soon.